I have known many gods. He who denies them is as blind as he who trusts them too deeply. I seek not beyond death. It may be the blackness averred by the Nemedian skeptics, or Crom's realm of ice and cloud, or the snowy plains and vaulted hills of the Nordheimers' Valhalla. I know not, nor do I care. Let me live deep while I live. Let me know the rich juices of red meat and stinging wine on my palate, the hot embrace of white arms, the mad exaltation of battle, when the blue blades flame and crimson, and I am content. Let teachers and priests and philosophers brood over questions of reality and illusion. I know this. If life is illusion, then I am no less an illusion. And being thus, the illusion is real to me. I live, I burn with life, I love, I slay, and am content.
Hello, and welcome or welcome back, as the case may be, to the Atlantean Archive. Thank you to those who have subscribed recently, to those of you who have liked the videos on the channel and have shared the content, for those of you who have left comments. You know, all of these things are essential to getting the attention of the all-seeing eye of YouTube, perched atop Baradur or wherever that thing is. But that algorithm looks for all of this kind of stuff, so I appreciate those of you who have done that. You've made the channel more visible. It's already grown a little bit more than I thought it would, just starting from scratch a few weeks ago. So that's great to see, and hope it'll continue to grow. Hope that this content I'm providing here is of interest to you. Now, September, for those of you on BookTube who've been observing it, has been a Cimmerian September, where BookTubers have been reading the original Robert E. Howard Conan stories. And I've enjoyed that, getting back into those. I've done a couple of videos, one on the Phoenix on the Sword, the other on the Tower of the Elephant, both great stories. The Tower of the Elephant is a classic, especially a great story to introduce people to Conan with. Anybody who hasn't read that before, it's a great introduction to sword and sorcery. It's just like a perfect short sword and sorcery story. So, great example of Robert E. Howard's best writing. As we're closing out Cimmerian September, I did want to address a couple of topics here. Hopefully have time for one more video on the issue. But the one I want to do today touches on a topic that doesn't get a whole lot of attention, and that's probably because there just isn't a whole lot that's been written on it. Howard didn't write a whole lot about it. And that is the topic of Crom, Conan's dark god. You know, Conan is a Cimmerian. He comes from a northern land, a very barbarous people who live in very inhospitable country. They are always at war with their neighbors. They live in a very bleak land, though, and they tend to be a bleak people. They reflect the land that they live in. We see this in the Phoenix on the Sword, when one of Conan's trusted aides, a guy by the name of Prospero, is talking to him, and he's telling him that he's different. Conan is different than any other Cimmerian that Prospero has ever come across. Conan likes to drink wine. Prospero says, you know, I've only ever seen Cimmerians drink water. They don't sing anything but dirges, and Conan likes these ribald-type songs. And he's just pointing this out to Conan and wondering why there's such a difference between him and the other members of his race. And Conan says this to him: perhaps it's the land they live in. A gloomier land never was, all of hills, darkly wooded under skies nearly always gray, with winds moaning drearily down the valleys. They have no hope here or hereafter. Their gods are Crom and his dark race, who rule over a sunless place of everlasting mist, which is the world of the dead. Mitra, the ways of the Asir, were more to my liking. So yeah, Conan is not typical of the Cimmerians. Apparently they don't venture far, at least not in large numbers, and Conan, by his own word, has been all over the Hyborian world. He's visited all of its cities, all the lands in between. He knows its people. He's done all sorts of things. He's been a pirate, a thief, pretty much anything you can think of, a general at times, and ultimately he'll become a king. So he's different. And as I went into in previous videos, Conan is more or less, it seems to me, and others agree with this, it's Robert E. Howard's, almost his avatar. It's basically his idea of a perfect fighting man, a perfect man, to take on the entire world and wrest whatever he wants from it. It just seems to live up to his ideal of what the fierce, free, independent man should be, the thing that Robert E. Howard most identified with and most wanted to be. I think King Kull was more who Howard actually was, more of a brooding figure. And it's interesting when you compare the worlds of Kull and Conan. Kull's world is much less defined. Howard didn't write as much about Kull. That's probably part of it. But it just seems like you have a couple of places where Kull is at immediately in the story, but the rest of it is very diffuse. It seems to bleed off the page and like an incomplete thought. You just don't have much there. It's very mysterious and incomplete. And that seems to reflect the thinking of Robert E. Howard himself. Howard was not sure of the world. He was not sure of his place in the world or what the whole thing was about. When you look at his correspondence and what people who knew him have to say about him, that comes out. Novelyn Price, who knew Howard, was his only girlfriend that we ever know of. She wrote about him. And he told her that, "I have lived before. I remember it," he told her. "My ancestors come from a cold, bleak island, and I feel their blood beating in my veins." To H.P. Lovecraft, he wrote this. I think it's very interesting. "I believe that many dreams are the result of ancestral memories, handed down through the ages. I have lived in the Southwest all of my life, yet most of my dreams are laid in cold, giant lands of icy wastes and gloomy skies, and of wild, windswept fens and wildernesses, over which sweep great sea winds, and which are inhabited by shock-headed savages with light, fierce eyes. With the exception of that one dream I described to you, I am never, in these dreams of ancient times, a civilized man. Always I am the barbarian, the skin-clad, tussle-haired, wide-eyed wild man, armed with a rude axe or sword, fighting the elements and wild beasts, or grappling with armored hosts, marching with the tread of civilized discipline from fellow fruitful lands and walled cities. This is reflected in my writings, too. For when I begin a tale of old times, I always find myself instinctively arrayed on the side of the barbarian against the powers of organized civilization." So it's interesting here. Howard believed that, possibly in a reincarnation sense, that he had lived in a previous place. This was originally where he was from, was some cold, bleak land, very similar to how he describes Cimmeria, and that he was the barbarian, always. That's what he identified most closely with. That's what his soul was. It's interesting. In another place, he writes, "I believe that all human desires, aims, and pretensions are ultimately futile and empty, leading from nothing to nothing." And you can see that in a land like Cimmeria. People like the Cimmerians, the way Howard describes this. Is it therefore very surprising that Crom turns out to be the kind of god that he is? It's interesting when you look at Crom and what Howard writes about him. He's not like any other of the gods of mythology that I'm familiar with. Maybe some of those of you who are better read in fantasy than I am, you might find something equivalent out there. But Crom is pretty unique as far as I know. He is a god without a cult, really, without temples, without rituals. There are no 10 commandments that you have to follow, nothing like that. He doesn't expect anything of you, and he's not interested in giving anything to you. He is indifferent. He seems to be, in a very real way, a personification of the land of Cimmeria itself. He is as uncaring and foreboding as the land is. And Conan goes on with a little bit more of a description in Queen of the Black Coast, which is one of the best Conan stories, I think. Conan falls in with a group of pirates under the command of a pirate queen named Belit, who becomes basically the love of his life, if you could say he has any such thing. And Belit is asking him, as they're about to come to this unknown shore, a land of horror and death, as she describes it. She asks him if he's afraid, and he shrugs it off. And she says she's not afraid either. She's faced death too many times. But then she asks him, "Conan, do you fear the gods?" And they get into this theology discussion here. "I would not tread on their shadow. answered the barbarian conservatively. Some gods are strong to harm, others to aid. At least so say their priests. Mitra of the Hyborians must be a strong god because his people have builded their cities over the world. But even the Hyborians fear Set. And Bel, god of thieves, is a good god. When I was a thief in Zamora, I learned of him. But what of your own gods? Belit asks him. I have never heard you call on them. Their chief is Crom. He dwells on a great mountain. What use to call on him? Little he cares if men live or die. Better to be silent than to call his attention to you. He will send you dooms, not fortune. He is grim and loveless, but at birth he breathes power to strive and slay into a man's soul. What else shall men ask of the gods? But what of the worlds beyond the river of death? She persisted, asking about the afterlife here. There is no hope here or hereafter in the cult of my people, answered Conan. In this world men struggle and suffer vainly, finding pleasure only in the bright madness of battle. Dying, their souls enter a gray, misty realm of clouds and icy winds to wander cheerlessly throughout eternity. And then he gets on about how he lives for battle and let the teachers and priests and philosophers brood over the questions of reality and illusion, as I read at the very beginning of the video. I live, I burn with life, I love, I slay, and am content. Interesting, especially with what I just read in the excerpts of Howard's letters and what Novelyn Price had to say about what he said to her. You can understand why Conan's God is the way he is. He is basically the personification of the indifferent land of Cimmeria, which Robert E. Howard seemed to identify with most himself. He thought that at some point in the past he and or his ancestors came from such a land, and the barbarian was part of his soul. Always, he says, when he writes his tales of ancient times, he is taking the part of the barbarian against the side of organized civilization. And you see that with Conan traveling from one kingdom to another, seeing all the gods of the kingdoms, and even realizing that they exist. As he tells Belit, he knows these gods exist. He's encountered supernatural beings in the Tower of the Elephant. He even encounters a genuine alien. He's seen all kinds of crazy stuff, fought half human, half beast monsters at various times. He knows these things are real, but he doesn't pay them any regard. You don't see him going into the temples of Mitra and offering sacrifice or doing any kind of obeisance to any of these gods in the various places that he travels, yet he admits they exist. Conan was forged in the land of indifference. As far as he's concerned, when he was born, his God gave him the physical abilities he has to cope with life and to take what he needs or what he wants from it. And that's all there is. His God is not going to give him anything more, and he has no right to ask anything more. He has no right to expect anything more. And those who do call upon him, Conan says, Crom sends them dooms. And you don't write your 23rd Psalm to Crom. His rod and his staff will not comfort you. They will hit you upside the head. If you're in the hospital, you're not going to get card like you would get from one of your Christian friends where it says something like, we're praying the Lord will heal you and bring you out of this difficult time and sustain you through this valley that you're traveling. No, Crom's going to tell you to get your lazy butt out of bed. You can rest when you're dead. That's basically the way Crom is. And he's forged, again, he's a personification of the land the Cimmerians live in, and really a personification of Robert E. Howard's outlook on life. He wasn't always this gloomy, but Howard was prone, as he said himself, to rages. He was prone to long fits of depression. Of course, he committed suicide at the age of 30. He apparently had no hope, either here or in the hereafter. In a letter to Lovecraft, he described himself as an agnostic. He didn't know whether there was anything on the other side of life or not. He just didn't know. Lovecraft, of course, was an outspoken atheist, and Howard knew that. But he himself, he didn't know what to believe. And again, going back to that world of King Kull, that very undefined world, it seems to mirror Howard's personality and his outlook on life, because he himself wasn't sure what to make of this. He looks at life as from the excerpt that I read there, and he just doesn't see any point to it. He doesn't see where it's going. He says he sees men striving for, as he puts it, basically fighting for nothing. He doesn't see any point in any of the struggles that men and women face. They just move from one thing to the next, from one day to the next, getting whatever it is that they can. And Conan saying here that, you know, if you call on Crom, who doesn't care, who has given you everything you need at birth, all you're going to get at birth, and then you have to go out and do for yourself. If you call on him, he's just going to send you dooms. How is that a reflection? It seems to be, to me at least, it fits with the idea that if you come into this world with everything you're ever going to get, there is no God who is ever going to intervene on your behalf. You can't expect help from anyplace else. If you call out for help, you are wasting time. You are wasting effort that you could be using with the abilities you presently have, all you're ever going to get to deal with a situation. So you're effectively making the situation worse on yourself, bringing it down on yourself. It's not going to get any better. You're actually actively hurting yourself by appealing to someone who isn't going to help you. And in the case of Howard as an agnostic, it would be someone that he's not even sure exists in the first place, is there to help you. So all of this makes sense when you look at how Conan approaches everything in all of his stories. Again, if this is a Robert E. Howard avatar, as he really seems to be, Howard writing his thoughts, his worldview, his innermost feelings through Conan, whom he idealizes, then you can understand why in another story, for instance, I think it's the Pool of the Black One, when they barely escape from a monster, Conan again with a pirate crew, and he's got the pirate's wife, the guy that he killed. She's his now. And at the very end, after they've escaped from this and fought for their lives and just barely escaped, he turns to the woman and he says, "Give me a kiss." And she says, "After all we've been through, how can you think of kisses?" And he says, "I think of life," which is exactly what he tells Belit. I live, I slay, and I am content. Because that's all he's ever going to get. So he's using what he has to get what he can while he lives. That's his philosophy. And he moves from place to place. The philosophy remains the same. He doesn't honor the gods of any of these other lands, other cities that he visits, because he doesn't see anything to it. Because Howard didn't see anything to it. And this is Howard living out a fantasy life in this Hyborian age that he created. So that, I think, is where Conan's dark, gloomy God comes from. It comes from the rather dark, gloomy imagination of Robert E. Howard, which is so energetic, so vivid, so full of life and all of Conan's striving, and yet ultimately is pointless in its own way. I mean, even Howard himself wrote that he didn't know what kind of end that Conan would come to. He had no idea what was ultimately going to happen to his character. He says Conan seems to tell him his stories as he writes these things out. And he's like any other adventurer. He just says, "Oh, once upon a time I did this. And oh, let me tell you about another time when I did that." It just doesn't seem to be going anywhere because Howard himself wasn't sure where life was going. It makes a lot of sense when you think of it that way. So I hope geeking out like this on the character and the fictional world that Howard created and connecting that back to Howard and his personality, I hope that makes sense. I hope that's interesting to you. It was interesting to me because when I read these things, I really see why Conan has the motivations that he does, why he doesn't seem to care about other things that most people value so highly, because Howard himself didn't care about these things because he saw no ultimate point in any of them. And the land of Cimmeria reflects that. The land of Cimmeria is a reflection of Howard's soul, really, his outlook, his philosophy. And Conan is a product of that as a Howard avatar, again, moving through life in this way. And his God, quote unquote, he's really kind of useless as a God, ultimately reflects all of that. It's the personification of that dark, gloomy kind of ideology. So Robert E. Howard, complicated guy and a deep thinker, a lot deeper and more profound a thinker than many have given him credit for, especially those who simply want to dismiss him as just a pulp writer who liked to write about heroes rescuing scantily clad damsels, that sort of thing, as Robert Bloch objected. Anyway, I hope to bring you at least one more video on Conan, if I can get that cranked out before September ends here, Cimmerian September. and I'll be at work on that, and hopefully we'll have that for you tomorrow or Sunday. In the meantime, if you haven't seen the last video I did, and you have any interest at all in retro television production, anything like that, those of you who grew up like I did, you Gen Xers out there, grew up in the 70s and 80s, you remember the kids shows, you remember what independent TV stations were like, the kind of programming they had, that sort of thing, the local TV personalities. I think you'll enjoy my interview with Dick Dysel. He was a well-known personality in the Washington, D.C. area in the 1970s and 80s on Channel 20. He wore many hats there. He was Bozo the Clown. He was Captain 20, who hosted the kids show there. He hosted an Emmy award-winning program called Kids Break. And on Saturday nights, he was a horror host as Count Gordeval on Channel 20's Creature Feature. Did that for a number of years. He was actually the first horror host to go online in 1998, and he's still doing it today, celebrating his 50th year as the character Count Gordeval that he created back there in the 70s. So if you have any interest, even if you're not from the Washington, D.C. area and you have never heard of him before and you don't know anything about 20 or any of the characters he portrayed, if you remember that era, you remember the kids show, you remember horror hosts, you remember all that sort of thing, and you've ever wondered what it was like to work in independent television broadcasting back then, just the kind of stations where they worked on a shoestring budget and flew by the seat of their pants, I think you'll really enjoy that interview with Dick Dysel. So that was my last video, and up on the channel there, I just added chapters to it just the other day. I had to manually do that because YouTube won't do that automatically below a certain number of subscribers. So I hope you find that interesting, and until next time, God bless.
What gods do you pray to?
I pray to the four winds. And you?
To Crom, but I seldom pray to him. He doesn't listen.
What good is he then?